Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Hopefully you've had your coffee and at least a couple hours sleep and you're ready today, because this is one of the most important, granted albeit not the most exciting, topics we're going to cover this semester. Today we're talking about the thesis. And we use this voiceover because the thesis is one of the most important things for your writing personally, for your next essay assignment, for this course, for any writing you're going to do, whether in the humanities or even in your labs and in your science classes, and as in the workplace, because the thesis is what guides all of your other writing. So today what I hope to do is we're going to talk about the thesis a little bit. I'm going to introduce the idea and we're going to talk about it, and then we're going to break into some small groups. We're going to do some small group work with the reading that we read for today's class, and then hopefully we'll come back and as a class we'll have a larger discussion on the thesis at that time, okay? What I want you to come out of here today is the familiarization with the thesis, what a thesis is, how to construct a thesis, and what we're working towards is next class's thesis and topic workshop for your first assignment, the observational essay, and of course for that essay, which, plug, is due next week. Right? It's never too early to start plugging your assignments and making sure they're the forefront or the mid-range of your brain. So to pick up where we left off last class, we were talking about the writing process. There are these steps, it's sort of this consensus ideas of what is required of writing process and what is required of us as writers. Right? So we have pre-writing. What were the other ones? Does anybody remember what we talked about last week? Say it.
Drafting.
Drafting. Let's see. Others. Yes, Gus. What was it?
Editing. No.
Editing? Yeah. We've got the editing. And revision. Right, we talked about submission, and this is included when the powers that be and the people who work in writing all the time talk about it. They include submission. For our purposes, it's less interesting because it's sort of the end goal, which is of course crucial, but it's not part of the process. It's what we want to look at is how we think about what our ideas are, how we write them, and then as we said last week, this comes back again, right? There's never this linear pattern. You're always drafting and composing, then you're doing your revisions. You go back and you draft again, you edit some, you go back, right? This is multiple steps, multiple times. Somewhere in here, somewhere in between the pre-writing and the drafting is where your thesis occurs, okay? We talked about, last week we talked about the pre-writing more thoroughly. It's this idea you take the assignment, you look at your parameters, and again, this is in this classroom, in this course, but it's also in a job, in an occupation, your boss gives you a task and you need to find out what the parameters are, right? What is expected, what do you need to fulfill, what do you need to focus on. So you talk about the assignment, you go into this brainstorming, free writing. We talked a little bit about the different processes that allow us to generate ideas, possibilities for our work. Then we identify questions, issues, some of the problems that might come up. And then we go into this idea, we're developing a focus for this. And at that time, as we develop this focus, we generate what in composition is called a working thesis. We want to have an idea that launches us into this next stage of drafting. So to begin the drafting process, we need to have an idea that we're talking about, right? So what is a thesis? Do we have some sense of it, having reviewed Hacker a little bit, right? We've got a writer's reference. We're using it as if it were the good book or a good book, and we're making our way through it, or not. Someone besides Sadie, who clearly did all the reading, but we'd like to get some other people involved in the conversation. Anybody else have a sense of what a thesis is?
It's like a hypothesis?
Perfect, yes. We were all writing that because I can't spell hypothesis, but of course this is perfect because the hypothesis is exactly what a working thesis needs to be considered, right? Hypothesis, for those of you who aren't familiar, is this idea, this theory to be tested. And that's exactly what this descriptor provides us, right? It's a sense of development. We need to test this idea and move on. So this idea of hypothesis, it's your fundamental point to your argument. It's the commitment you make to your readers. There are a lot of analogies that we can talk about that bring us in this direction. There's a roadmap. I've read it as an umbrella that keeps all of your ideas dry. The mortar that holds the bricks of your paper together. All of these different ways to think about the thesis. What it is it's talking about what you're going to write about. For your reader, it's telling them where you're heading with your argument. For you as a writer, it's setting up the structure, it's dictating where you're going to go. So if you go in a different direction, you need to address that and change your thesis and alter the direction of your paper. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. So this idea of hypothesis, returning to Kim's point, is perfect. And it's not just a literary thing. This is something that needs to be worked through, no matter what you're working in. A hypothesis, you test this, you come back again and you test it again, you rewrite it a little bit, you test it again. So it's a hypothesis. Other terms that apply: a primary claim, a controlling idea. It is essentially the final result of this pre-writing stage. It's a jumping off point for your drafting stage, okay? So we get a sense of how this comes about then, we get this developed focus. So now at this point, we've got a thesis, but we're not really sure what is a thesis? This sort of gives us a general idea, but the thesis itself, how do we construct it, is the other thing we want to be cognizant of and thinking about while we approach the workshop for next class rather. So again, we have steps, right? This makes everything easier. So what you need for a thesis, you need a subject or a topic. You need an opinion. Oh, not an onion. We're not making stew. You need an opinion, and then you need what we might call the reasoning or blueprint. This is a little bit fuzzier because this is the part that takes time. This is the part that actually develops. This is the part that requires evidence, research, more brainstorming, more thought. So this is a little bit harder for the people who have sort of constructed this myth and this model to talk about, but what it is a blueprint. You want to identify in your thesis what people are going to be finding in your essay, right? So working with this idea of a blueprint then, we have a sense of a blueprint is a plan, is the map of a structure in architecture. Right? So these three things, and again, this is not something that you'll be thinking of specifically, but what it is a model that allows us to talk about this thesis in more depth. These components, you won't sort of say, well, I need a subject, I need an opinion, I need reasons. What will happen is you think immigration, it's a good idea, why? This is how the thesis develops. Breaking it down like this helps us get a better sense of it, that's all. And it's a little bit tough in the papers that you'll be writing for next week, the observational essays, because there the thesis is more of it's less specific. There's not a point wherein your thesis occurs, it's more of an impression on your reader. But as you move in through the semester, looking at your analytical writing and looking more specifically and most importantly at your research work, what you have there is a very specific argument that you'll make, a very specific claim that you'll make, and that will help you develop your thesis. But even at this stage, we can write and have an idea of what the thesis is in these observational essays. To return to our trusty Diane Hacker writer's reference, which I'm sure you're all enjoying, she gives us some examples of the thesis and problems that occur. So for instance, a draft thesis in the sciences might be something like, according to Diane Hacker, mapping the human genome has many implications for health and science. Right? This is not a great thesis, but it gives us a chance to look at this. So the subject and topic is mapping the genome. has many implications for health and science. Well, this doesn't really work, right? This gives us our subject, and it's an opinion, but there's not really a blueprint for your essay, and there's not really, this is very vague, right? This language has many implications. What does that mean? It doesn't really mean anything, right? It's sort of, okay, that's interesting, but it's not specific. It's not going to be able to fit into a draft. So through this process of evolution and development, what eventually comes of it is, although scientists can now detect genetic predispositions for specific diseases, policymakers should establish guidelines about whom to test and under what circumstances. That sounds a little more coherent, right? That's a little more developed. Now we know specifically what we're looking at. Policymakers should establish guidelines about whom to test and under what circumstances. Versus has many implications for health and science. Are we getting a sense of how this happens? And this process, again, you might not think of it in these terms, but this process is essentially how it all comes about. So even in your observational essays, due next week, where we talk about Worcester, we want to look at a person, a place, a thing, something of interest in Worcester, and we want to write an observational essay about it, describe it, ask questions, and investigate it further. We can still develop a thesis. Maybe it won't be a strong thesis, it won't occur right after the introduction and be an immediate catalyst for our discussion, but it'll be in there. The impression that our readers want to get will be part of that discussion, okay? So you want to think about this as you start to craft your thesis and topic for our next class. What I want to do now is break into small groups. What we're going to do is in groups of 2 or 3, it can be your neighbors around you, behind you, however you see fit. We're going to talk a little bit about what makes a strong thesis versus a weak thesis, an effective thesis versus an ineffective thesis. So now we have a sort of a sense, right? We talked about what a thesis is and how it comes apart. You want these different parts. What we're going to look at, I'll hand out a paper in a moment that will give you some sense of how to test the theses. We're going to return to the works we read for today, and even if you didn't get a chance to read them, you'll be able to look at this thesis and help your group break it down. What we want to do is highlight or annotate, however you choose, the thesis that each writer has incorporated into their essays. And then we want to think about whether it's a strong thesis or a weak thesis and why. And after you think about these things and talk amongst yourselves as a group, what we're going to do is come back as a class and then sort of have a larger discussion on what makes a stronger thesis, what makes a weaker thesis. And we started here in Hacker, but to work through it ourselves and get a sense of what we need to include, what we need to remember as we approach these papers for next week and as we approach this topic for next class, okay? So let's go ahead and break into groups. I will hand out the sheet in a minute that gives you a sense of how to test the thesis and what to expect as you test the thesis. What are some characteristics of a strong thesis versus a weak thesis? And then we'll come back again as a class and discuss that a little further.